Welcome to Unit 4, Lecture number 2, Classical Conditioning. This is arguably the most important lecture of the whole unit. It is the most important because it is the most complicated. The words themselves are not all that hard, but there are a lot of them just within this one topic. And then I have this cute little meme, and it might not make any sense to you just yet, but hopefully it will if you watch this more than once. As I was saying, this is the only topic in this whole lecture. It's just classical conditioning, but there's a lot of terminology within this topic that we have to understand. That's what makes this one so tricky. Okay, so I'm going to... I even laughed to give you this definition, but this is what it is, and it's not going to make a lot of sense, but here it is. It is learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about a response after it is paired with a stimulus which naturally brings about that response. So this is also known as stimulus to stimulus learning. I'm going to give you a brief example. You do not need to write it down. I just suggest you listen. We associate lightning and thunder together. Over time, if you are jumpy when you hear a loud noise, like when you hear thunder kind of out of the blue, when you see lightning, you might, I just punched myself in the face. You might, that wasn't planned. You might learn to jump or wince when you see lightning because that loud noise that comes from thunder naturally makes you jump. And so over time, you learn to jump for the lightning in anticipation of the thunder. Stimulus, lightning, stimulus, thunder, and that thunder gets traded in for you jumping to that loud noise, or what you anticipate would be that loud noise. It's okay if that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of learning still to go. Classical conditioning was identified or discovered, I guess, by Ivan Pavlov. This is a super important name. You must know that Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning. I know do it like this because it's something that happened before, but he's the one that really identified it. He is a Russian physiologist, I think I said that right, who exposed classical conditioning to the world. He was not a psychologist. He was actually studying digestion, and he noticed that the dogs he was studying were salivating when he put the food in front of them, but before they actually ate the food. And so his research was so important, he won a Nobel Prize, and, pretty big deal. But he kind of just stumbled upon his research as opposed to seeking it out. Before I teach you anything about how classical conditioning works, we need to understand a couple terms. First of all, a stimulus. This is a thing the subject responds to. We've learned about stimuli quite a bit at this point. These are the things that we hear, smell, taste, and so on and so on. The thing that we're responding to. So you could put down, you could put down thunder. A response is the action or reaction to the stimulus. It might be a feeling. It might be a feeling of joy. It might be salivating if something smells good. It might be a wince or a jump if something scares you. Something is neutral if you have no reaction to it. So, for example, my sweater is orange. That should be a neutral stimulus. It's just seeing a color. So that shouldn't really generate any sort of feeling. Over time it might, or with experience it might, with learning it might, but on its own, no reaction, neither good or bad. It just is. It's just a thing. Here is just a pencil. It is just a neutral stimulus. It's not creating any reaction. It's just a thing. Unconditioned means naturally existing, untrained. So jumping at fear is natural. That is an unconditioned response to something. Or conditioned. This is something that you have to learn. You have to be taught or trained that a reaction to it. So for example, money. It is just metal or it is just paper. We are conditioned to believe that money has value. So those are just some terminology. Now, some important points about those terminologies, those terms. An unconditioned stimulus will lead to an unconditioned response. These are natural involuntary actions. Loud noises lead to someone being scared. Okay? Conditioned stimulus lead to conditioned responses. So you might be taught that a dollar bill will make you happy. Okay? You have to learn that there's meaning behind that dollar bill and then learn that it can get you things. And yes, there's a lot of abbreviations, so it is important to write down these abbreviations and learn them. And then a neutral stimulus elicits no response at first and then becomes a conditioned response. So a piece of paper in the form of a dollar bill is neutral at first until you are taught that it is something that can make you happy. And the last point I'd like to make before moving on is the UCR and the CR, the unconditioned response and conditioned response, are almost always the same or very similar. This is one of those times, again, where I say, if you understand nothing so far, that's okay. If you understand something, even better. Okay, we're going to go over Pavlov's experiment. And at this point, I don't want you to write down anything. I'm going to just tell it like a story, and I'll help you figure out what to put on those lines in just a little bit. So Pavlov would present the dog with some food. And what he found is that the dog would salivate. This is considered the unconditioned stimulus because food on its own causes an unconditioned response, makes the dog salivate. So we don't need to be taught that when we smell good food that we salivate. Our body just does it on its own. Then he learned that by sounding a bell, no response would happen. The dog would be like, what? It's a bell. I don't care. I don't care about no stinking bell. I'm not going to do anything. And so a bell would be neutral, would not cause the dog to naturally do anything. Over time, Pavlov repeatedly would ring a bell and present food. Ring bell, present food a split second later. Ring bell, present food. Ring bell, present food. It was actually a tuning fork. This is an old-fashioned tool that makes sound like a bell. We'll talk more about that in class. And what would happen? But the dog would salivate every time. That's what would happen. So by pairing a neutral stimulus with that unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. So something like a bell that shouldn't make the dog naturally do much of anything, paired with something that made it salivate, and it would continue to salivate. This is called the acquisition phase. More on this to come. So to see if conditioning was successful, Pavlov then presented just that neutral stimulus, just the bell. No food this time. So after doing it over and over and over, he just rang the bell. If the dog responded like he predicted, he considered this successful conditioning. And sure enough, that's what happened. So what is now the conditioned stimulus produced an unconditioned response. In other words, that neutral stimulus, that bell that didn't do anything special to the dog, became the conditioned stimulus that now made him salivate. Okay, let's add some notes on acquisition, and we're going to get all of this down on your paper. So acquisition. This is the phase where the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So it's the training. The neutral stimulus has to come before the unconditioned stimulus. In most cases, there are exceptions. Just write down in most cases. I'm not going to get into those cases right now. But a neutral stimulus, the bell, would have to come right before the food. Because if the food came first, the dog would already be salivating before it heard that bell. So the neutral stimulus has to come before the unconditioned stimulus. The time between those stimuli needs to be within seconds. If you ring the bell and then wait a couple minutes and then present the food, the dog's not going to learn that the bell might mean food's coming. And to know if the conditioning occurred, you must present only the conditioned stimulus and not that neutral stimulus, and wait to see if the conditioned response happens. All right, so let's get this on your notes. In your little box there, write down that food is the unconditioned stimulus and it produces salivation. Food, unconditioned, salivation, unconditioned, both of those things happen in the dog's body naturally. Then a bell would trigger no response. Then the bell paired with the food created that same unconditioned response, that same natural response of salivation. I would like you to put a little star like right here and then draw an arrow down to the acquisition in your notes. So this line, this is the acquisition, this is the teaching line. What would happen if the teaching or conditioning was done correctly? The bell would trigger salivation. Okay, at this point you should be able to turn the page in your note. Okay, let's come up with an example of something that could happen currently in your home. Let's say every time someone flushes a toilet in your house, like on the first floor, the shower that you're in the second floor becomes very, very hot and causes that you in the shower to jump back because, it's hot water. Okay, so let's break this down. First of all, there is hot water. That is an unconditioned stimulus that makes you jump back. If water is too hot, it makes you jump back. Okay, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. The toilet flushing on its own creates no response. There's nothing for you to be scared of, jump back from. It's just a toilet flushing. However, by pairing that sound with hot water, so the toilet flushes and it immediately causes hot water to come out of the shower, it's going to cause you to jump back. If that happens enough times over and over and over again, because that's the plumbing in your house, it's kind of weird like that, eventually hearing the toilet flush might make you jump back because your brain is almost expecting that hot water to come out. So what was a neutral stimulus, the toilet flushing, that was no big deal, nothing that ever scared you before, is now a conditioned stimulus that instead of creating no response, now creates that conditioned response. So it was unconditioned in relation to the hot water, but now you've been taught to fear the toilet flushing. Okay, a couple quick examples of how we are all classically conditioned already. Advertisements do this to us all the time. They pair an attractive person or a successful person with a certain product. So, like, wear Maybelline makeup and you will be beautiful, just like the Maybe It's Maybelline girl. Or if you buy Nikes, you are going to run as fast as insert athlete they show running fast. And so that's conditioning you to think that that brand is going to make you beautiful, successful, faster, stronger, whatever. We are all very guilty of getting up to leave the room whenever we hear the bell ring at the end of class. Even if we know, like, oh guys, the bells are being tested today, or you know that the bells are off schedule, don't just get up. That's still our instinct. When we hear a bell, we want to end class, we want to get up and leave the room. We might be conditioned to a certain level of anxiety when we hear the sound of our dentist drill, that zzz sound. If you've had some bad dental experiences, you might be conditioned to feel anxious when you hear it. So these are just some common examples of how many of us are already conditioned without even realizing it. A couple more words that we need to learn in association with classical conditioning, and the first one is extinction. So here's your definition, but I do want you to sketch in this little graph. I will go through them again in class, but just get it down right now. So extinction is when an unconditioned stimulus, in Pavlov's case the food, does not follow a conditioned stimulus, the bell. The conditioned response, salivation, starts to decrease and at some point goes extinct. So at some point, the dog's going to realize that the bell does not always mean food, and so it's not going to continue to salivate over and over again when that food doesn't come along with the bell. Spontaneous recovery tells us that after a rest period, an extinguished conditioned response spontaneously recovers. In other words, comes back. That salivation will come back. But if the bell or conditioned stimulus persists alone, extinction will happen again. Again, copy this graph. I will talk about this again in class. Next is stimulus generalization. And this is a subject's tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimuli. So for example, Pavlov, and this was real, Pavlov conditioned his dogs to salivate to small vibrations on their thighs. So just like he did with the bell, he would pair a vibration with food till they salivated, did that over and over again until they just salivated when they felt the vibration. But what's interesting, and what stimulus generalization is getting at, is that the dogs would also salivate to vibrations on body parts near the thigh. So something that was similar. If I think about the bells at school indicate to us to get up out of our chair and switch classes. But every once in a while we have a weird bell at school, or we might have a fire alarm, and so we still get up to leave the classroom. So that's when you generalize. So you react to something that is similar. What's interesting about the Pavlov vibration situation is the further away from the thigh the vibration got, the less the dog salivated, which brings us to our final part, which is stimulus discrimination. This is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that don't signal the unconditioned stimulus or the food. So just like the dogs realized that if the vibration was too far from their thigh, they weren't going to get food, and so they could tell the difference. Pavlov also tested this by ringing different tones on the tuning fork, and so it wasn't just that bell sound, it was like a higher pitch sound or a lower pitch sound. And so the dog was able to tell the difference eventually, that this type of sound didn't mean food and this type of sound did, and so I'm going to salivate to this one but not this one. So being able to tell the difference. There are some more spots on your notes to practice this again, and we are going to do those together. So this is it for now. Don't worry, we're going to practice this a lot. This is a tricky one.